Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. After spending her early life fundamentally changing how the world connects, Carolyn Starrett made a shift towards changing how the world lives. Her move into healthcare was driven by purpose, eventually becoming CEO of Flatiron Health. Carolyn took the reins during a turbulent transition where much of the senior team departed. It's through this gauntlet that she's proven her masterful ability to bring teams on a journey. She's an accidental CEO whose intentionality has been a revelation for the business that she's guided through times of extreme change. Today's conversation reads like a rulebook on how to build consensus, lead with purpose, and prepare a succession plan for when it's time to step down. So, very excited to have you on the podcast today, Carolyn, and welcome to Pivot Points. Could you just introduce yourself and let the listeners know a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So, hi, everyone, Carolyn Starrett. I currently live in New York and recently ended a tenure running a company called Flatiron Health in the healthcare technology space. We are a company that has a mission to learn from the experience of every person with cancer. So we can talk more about that. On the professional front, I spent most of my early career working in B2B technology companies, first in the networking space and then data and predictive analytics. And I was always fascinated by building infrastructure that could meaningfully change how we experience the world. So first it was building out the first generation of the internet with a networking company. And then it was building predictive analytics solutions to shift the consumer shopping experience back in the first kind of web 2.0 wave. And then I got to a point in my career where I realized I felt so passionate about the role data and technology could play in shaping how we experience the world. But I wanted to make sure I was pointing that at a problem that felt really, really meaningful. And that drew me to healthcare. You know, I think everyone has an experience of cancer somewhere in their life. Every one of my grandparents actually died from cancer. And I've had a couple very early stage melanomas myself. And so I was drawn to Flatiron as an opportunity to think about how could we use data and technology and start to make a dent in the experience people are having when they get a cancer diagnosis. So I had spent almost the last 10 years at Flatiron. I joined the company right after our Series C as we were starting to scale our solutions, and never expected to stay for 10 years, but was offered the opportunity to step into the CEO role 4.5 years ago after our two co-founders transitioned on. And so I did that. It's been a whirlwind journey as CEO at Flatiron. And I've recently transitioned out of that role and handed over to one of my executive team members. Mm-hmm. On the personal side, I am originally from California. I've bounced all over, lived in 5 countries and lots of cities. Love to travel, love live music, love the outdoors. And part of the driver of making the shift away from Flatiron is that I'll be moving back to the West Coast. I have 2 little boys, and I had 2 little boys over the last 3 years. One is 2.5 and one is 10 months. And so I'm figuring out the journey of what life means as a mother and heading back to the West Coast where we were from originally.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And go right back to the sort of early days. Did you ever think you were going to be CEO of something? Did that ever enter your head, or did you end up as a sort of accidental CEO?
I was definitely an accidental CEO. I don't think I ever thought I would be CEO until I got the call asking me if I wanted to do it at Flatiron. I will say I was always driven by having autonomy and new challenges and the opportunity to have a pretty large kind of runway to shape a strategy end to end and kind of build teams. And I'm someone who's really driven by impact. And so I really followed that throughout my career. And I think the people who are wired in that way, wired as an owner, wired as kind of a builder, tend to do well in a CEO role where you're kind of self-directed versus taking direction.
And when you sort of took on the role, did you start to reflect back and think, so in my previous careers, all of these things have given me the capabilities, the skills to actually be a good CEO, or did panic set in like it can often do when you get that role for the first time? I've talked to a lot of CEOs who are very driven to be CEOs and then realize it's not as much fun when they get there as they thought it might be.
Yeah. I mean, a little bit of both. It's funny. As I said, I wasn't driven to be a CEO, and I didn't think it looked like very much fun. So I went in eyes wide open, but I wasn't sure if I would like it.
Yeah.
But I cared a lot about what we were building. I cared about the team that we'd built. I thought we had just enormous potential ahead of us. And so I was really passionate about what we were doing. And I felt like I had, when our two co-founders transitioned on, which was a kind of planned succession, we had run a large external search, and Flatiron, my company, was a subsidiary of a large global pharmaceutical company, Roche. And so they kind of ran an external search, and I watched this happening from the sidelines and thought, hey, maybe I'll have an opportunity to learn from someone great. And if not, figure it out from there. And they just didn't find anyone who they felt like was the right risk. And so when they came to me and asked me to take it on, I certainly felt underprepared. I hadn't been thinking about taking that step at all. And there was a huge dose of just, oh my God, can I really do this? And I said to myself, well, okay, let me give this 2 years and see how it goes. I think I have a lot that I can bring to the company, and I care about the work, and so it's worth giving it a shot. I would say the first 18 months of those 2 years was probably the hardest of my career and the scariest of my career. And then at some point, in the middle of that second year, I realized it was actually the things that were, so traumatic when I first stepped into the role had become kind of norms and standardized. And I realized I was actually kind of liking it.
Yeah. And what was it that I guess made it tough in those first 2 years? Was it in your mind, or was it real?
I'd like to think it was actually pretty real. It was
Right.
probably both.
Yeah.
But we were kind of interesting situationally. So there are maybe three chapters of the Flatiron journey that I was a part of. So we started as a startup, and we're working to find product market fit and build our business and scale our impact. And then 2.5 years in, we were acquired, as I said, and we became an independent subsidiary of a large global company. The nature of our work was such that we had really strong firewalls and always operated totally independently from that new owner. And so nothing really changed in terms of how we organized, in terms of integration into a larger entity. But we did have this interesting dynamic where we had kind of a window of time in which I and some of the other senior leaders were asked to stay on board to kind of lead the company during those first few years post the acquisition. And at the same time, we knew that a lot of folks would be transitioning on at the end of that time frame. And so as that time frame was closing, we knew our co-founders would be leaving. A lot of the other senior leaders made the choice to leave. As I said, for me, it was kind of the middle of the pandemic. I love to ski. I looked at that time frame and I was enjoying my work. I was a general manager leading kind of one side of our business. And I took the opportunity to move to Jackson, Wyoming and ski a ton. And I, didn't really want to start a new job and do something new when I couldn't meet the team that I was going to be working with in person. And I also, couldn't travel at that point. It's the middle of the pandemic. And so, I was committed to sticking around. But what I walked into when I agreed to become CEO was 8 of the senior leadership team members transitioning out at the same time as I transitioned in, leaving me with kind of a team of 20 or so VPs who all reported to me directly, and without a clear organization and without a clear long-term strategy, and with a company that I think had a ton of promise and was doing really important work with a ton of passionate and incredible team members, but with like really no direction. So a lot of that first year was stepping back and figuring out, okay, what's the long-term strategy going to be now that we are, past this inflection point, and how do I build the team and structure to support that? And how do we build an operating model around that can help us think beyond now that we kind of know where we're going from here.
I mean, that's a huge shock to any business to get people exiting at roughly the same time and then trying to build a new leadership team and get that functioning and get a clear strategy and direction in place. Any sort of key learnings from that? If you had your time again, would you do it differently, or would you do exactly the same thing? Because we get a lot of conversations about leadership alignment and how do everybody has that phrase, are you on my bus or not on my bus? But getting an aligned leadership team, particularly in you got 20 direct reports. How did you do that? Because I think I would find that a challenge.
It was definitely a challenge. For the better part of the first year, I was doing a bunch of different roles. There's so much I would have done differently in retrospect. Like, I wish I had been in a position to get us to the answer faster in terms of where do we want to focus? How do we then organize to support that focus, and what next? And instead, because I really wasn't expecting to make this inflection point, and it was such a big, shift for the company. I think I spent too long kind of listening and hearing out all the different perspectives that were there. And I was kind of trying to lead from the vantage point of how do we build consensus around where to go. And I think what I had to do over time is get more and more comfortable figuring out, how long do I want to take to gather input and to build an understanding of the fact base and the data in front of us. And when is it the time to just make a call and move? And I let us sit, I think, for too long. It took us a little longer than I would have liked to get to kind of land that next strategy. It probably took a full 6 months to go through that. Things I did well, though, like once we got there, it was clear we needed to kind of reorganize around the business units that we were solving for. We had great internal leaders, as I said, and I was able to bring together and build a first executive team for the company that combined some folks who had been part of the Flatiron journey for a very long time, and then some key external hires who brought external perspective and experience that we didn't have, and really kind of build a team that could cohesively represent the best of what we had cultivated on our journey to date within Flatiron, and then really important external voices. And I think that really helped us do some pretty powerful work and high impact work over the next few years.
And once you got that sort of leadership team in place, did the business then fly? All the internal conversations stopped and you focused on the purpose of the organization again? Because it's really distracting when you've got a lot of internal structural things to resolve and to clarify. And, it's unsettling for you, it's unsettling for the people. But once you've got it in place, then you can focus on the important stuff and really get the organization sort of focused and performing. Did you see that transition through?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yes. And, that was kind of that pivot from when the job started to get fun, was when I had the team around me and we knew where we were going and we had a clear direction. I think the challenge then moved to how do you bring the organization along? And in our case, there was a big culture change that we had to land to win the hearts and minds, if you will, of the team writ large. One of the dynamics we were grappling with was that we had not a lot of discipline in the business. We almost thought of ourselves as a research research company, an academic institution. We were doing really great science and building evidence and data that could be used to help understand what drugs to develop and how to make the decisions on how to develop them. We didn't have a clear business model. We weren't focused on, the commercial success of the business. We weren't making clear, decisions around how much we could afford to spend, what was going to be sustainable over time. So a lot of that work of building the strategy was thinking about how do we build a business that can be sustainable and stand the test of time so that we can, make this impact lasting and really make this all worth it. And so one of the things I'm proudest of is that we did that over this period of time. And yet what that implies for people, 85% of our cost was people. It meant that we had to, do with fewer resources in a lot of places. We had to get smarter about how we deployed technology. We had to shift how people were working. We had to shift how we were making decisions. And, all of that culture change is a journey that you go through, over years. And it requires, people really embracing and being open to working in new ways. And so that certainly, was the next big challenge that we grappled with over the next few years. Paired with a economic climate where all of a sudden we were coming out of, the heyday of crazy spending in, coming in the late 2018 to 2020 timeframe, and then thinking about, okay, how do we actually prioritize efficiency, and what is the right way to think about investment and ROI and the long-term shape of the business.
And did the fact that you probably had a highly educated workforce, a very smart, intelligent workforce, getting smart, intelligent people to follow you is not easy.
Yeah. In some ways you can look back and say, I mean, we have a brilliant workforce. We were a company of around 1,200 people,
Yeah.
probably hundreds of them had advanced degrees, lots of clinicians and scientists and researchers paired with software developers and kind of ML and data science team members and some of the best operating teams that you could possibly imagine, working with cancer centers and working with our life sciences clients. And so it was a brilliant workforce. I think our DNA was very much entrepreneurs who wanted to build. And so the other pivot we were going through is we were kind of coming out of this phase where we were a startup. And, a lot of the career path and growth was about kind of building new things and, building teams and kind of leadership of people as we were hiring and growing and scaling the people to support the business. Part of, what we had to think about was how do we shift what that might look like in a world where we're not going to keep adding people to the business. And actually now it's about how do you do really interesting work that has real impact, and how do we create really meaningful growth around those opportunities, not around that, that one size fits all linear path going from an individual contributor to a manager to a leader.
Yeah. And what's your thinking now on collegiate consensus building leadership versus high directive leadership? Because I definitely meet leaders that fall into one of those two camps, and both absolutely have their merits. But what one probably gets to an answer faster than the other, but whether it takes people with you is still not clear in my mind.
I think I will always err towards building strong consensus. I think, when using a directive or approach, you really risk kind of losing the forest through the trees and just not bringing people along. So you may get there faster, but it's often I've seen the change doesn't stick or it doesn't land in the way you had hoped it'd land. And so on the margin, as I reflect back, like I think most of the time you want to get to a point where the team is bought in, the team understands there's a really kind of shared ownership for the most critical decisions in the business. And on the flip side, there are real moments when you have to be decisive and kind of make a really clear determination and avoid the kind of swirl of living in limbo land. And so I think being really intentional around what are the times to do that, and what are the decisions for which that is critical, and how do I make sure that when those critical moments arise, we really disagree and commit if that's the case, and are moving forward together, and not tolerating kind of the lingering, well, I don't really like this, so I'm just going to kind of ignore it situations.
No, I mean, it's a lot harder to build consensus and take people with you. It requires a lot more energy, effort, your time to get people aligned. But once they are aligned, my sense is you fly. But there are certain organizations, and probably not organizations where you've got the concentration of sort of graduates and doctorates that you have, where just the leader just tells people what to do. And that takes a lot of stress out of the situation for people. But then they can blame you and say, well, it was your decision. you did it.
Well, and I think there comes a point where, as we've made decisions, particularly with respect to culture change, just telegraphing who we are is really important. I think it's really respectful to our team members to say, like, this is what we can offer. This is where we're going. This is who we are. This is what career growth looks like at our company, and just be super clear on that. And there may be people who don't like it. We can't solve for making everyone happy. What we can solve for is being really clear on where we're going, why, how we can offer that, and then letting people opt in or opt out. And actually, I think one of the things my chief people officer said to me at one point, I was obsessed with tracking retention numbers and our people staying with us. We went through a period of very high attrition after I stepped in, and it was kind of like, but wait, do we actually want to focus on retention? What if these are the wrong people for the company that we are becoming? What if
Yeah.
we're not the right company for everyone who's here today because we're a different company than we were a few years ago? And so maybe the right answer is being really clear on who we are and then actively repelling people for whom, that's not the right fit. And you don't have to be perfect for everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really important, that, because a lot of people think attrition is a bad thing, and actually it can be a good thing. You need a certain amount of fresh faces, new ideas, new people, particularly, doing what you do. You've got to inject new thinking, new innovations. Yes. So that sort of focus on how you go about that. And if you've got 8 people who've left who will have set a certain style, a certain culture, now you're going, okay, well, what's our purpose? Why do we exist? Did you do that soul searching as part of your first few years? Did you really go, okay, our purpose in the world is changing and shifting, and use that to attract different types of people? Because what Flatiron does looks like incredibly valuable work.
Yeah, very much. That really was the work of the first year that I stepped in, because after the acquisition, I think we were blessed with having, both a ton of autonomy, as I said. We didn't really have to integrate or change anything about what we were doing. And then we received a ton of investment and, had the opportunity to, and I think used that time to place a few new bets, particularly those that were consistent with, strategic priorities for our new owner, but also just continued operating what we had. And so it was easy to just keep adding and saying, okay, this is the product portfolio, the set of solutions we have, and we're going to do these new things, and let's just keep doing more, more, more. And we had the luxury of investment and quite frankly, in retrospect, probably not enough constraints that forced tough decisions. And so a lot of the work of defining the vision was like, there's so many interesting things we can do, but we have to really get intentional about what are the most important things we can do. Where are we uniquely positioned to have a greater impact? And how do we ensure that the things we're doing, as I said earlier, actually have a business model that can enable them to be sustainable? And so really re-articulating, we actually made a very intentional effort. We went through a whole process to kind of re-articulate. The mission itself didn't change, but the vision and kind of all of the core elements and strategic pillars of where we were going. And that was a really important and foundational piece of, setting the stage for then starting to execute against that.
Changing sort of tack a little bit and just going back in time, you came into technology and then you moved into healthcare and technology. How did that pivot happen?
I grew up in the Bay Area and, started in the workforce in the first internet bubble. As I said, I had the opportunity to join a company called Juniper Networks as their very first intern. The summer they did an IPO in 1999, and so I think there were around 80 people at the company at that time, and Then over the next 5 years that I stayed with it, we scaled to 5,000 people. And so I got to see this incredible ride and take on, way more responsibility than I had earned very early in my career. And so it was a really transformative experience. And I moved from a couple of different marketing roles into a product management role. And I had the opportunity to see how all of these different disciplines come together to build really important hardware products. And I found that fascinating. And the thing I took away from it was how much I wanted to be a builder and how I wanted to be involved in solving really hard problems that I thought could have big impact on the world. But I didn't know that we had done it well, or I didn't really have any point of comparison after spending, 6 years at this company that had gone through this crazy roller coaster. So I went back and got my MBA, and then I still felt like I wasn't quite sure, where I wanted to go from there. I knew I loved this idea of building infrastructure and technology, but wasn't sure where to go. So I found my way into consulting and did strategy consulting, working across companies in the technology arena for a few years. But I also got the opportunity then in my consulting world to work a bit in healthcare, both in the pharma and kind of drug development space, and then in global health at the Gates Foundation. And that really sparked an interest for me and in thinking about, I wonder if there's more we could do with technology in this world. And yet at the same time, it still felt very slow to me relative to the pace of technology that I was seeing. And so after I left consulting, I went and did another startup in the data analytics space, and, you know, great experience, grew and scaled another company. But I think I always kept at the back of my mind the why. Like, what's the purpose of what we're building? Is it important enough? Is it a meaningful enough problem? And I got to a point where I just really felt like that was the thing that would most drive me. Why do I want to show up and come into work? It needs to be because I feel like the work that we're doing is inspiring enough to make me kind of want to stick with the hard journey. And so I just was very intentional in saying when I left that company that I wanted to find my way into a role where data and technology could play a role in health.
And so finding your why, did that change your outlook on the world and how you thought of business? Because you've gone through Juniper, you've gone through, was it Boston Consulting Group? And now you want to apply technology to something meaningful. That's several pivots. And, it takes a brave person to sort of stop being a Boston consultant and do something different and then go, I'm going to find out how to apply myself to something. Was that an easy process or?
I think we're all wired differently. I mean, I find that I am at my happiest and I am most energized when I feel incredibly challenged and when I'm working in kind of uncharted territory. So I think a common denominator throughout my career is when I get bored, I am not doing my best work and I'm all constantly chasing kind of what's a new experience that I can have. Where is there new learning to be found? How can I find another new challenge that's going to push me and force me to get out of my comfort zone? And I kind of like operating in that space. As I've gotten older, I've learned to appreciate the breaks in between those big challenges and learned that it's also important to, you can't be kind of constantly sprinting, to take, appreciate the valleys, if you will. But I think most of my changes have all stemmed from, I never thought of it as being scary as much as being an opportunity. And, I think that's one of the pieces of advice that I give to folks so often is if you can look at change as an opportunity, not a scary thing. I think that is a characteristic that will just serve you so well in your career because you're the person who thrives and gets energized when change is inevitable right now. If you're someone who kind of needs to put a box around what you do and needs to have really firm boundaries, it's really hard to maintain that. And so there's a sense of constant disappointment. Whereas if you can look at a changing world and say like, oh my God, what new opportunities does this open up? What new possibilities could exist now? It just, for me, has always meant that I look for the positive in things instead of anchoring down into what I don't have anymore.
Did you always realize you were not afraid of change and you saw change as an opportunity? Or did you figure that out later in your career? Because, I'd argue that's a key characteristic of a good chief executive, a good leader, that they've got to be excited by change and see change as an opportunity. And change just, I remember back in the 19th, somebody said to me, change is a constant.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny you say that. I hadn't thought about it on those terms for a long time, but I think back to there's someone came to speak to us at grad school. I was doing my MBA and they, did a study of what are the characteristics of the most successful leaders. And I still remember that. I don't remember who was doing the talk, but the theme was ability to embrace change is the strongest characteristic that they saw in this study of people who had succeeded in rising to the C-suite across, a long arc of time. And, then I think I kind of forgot about that. And I was, focused on doing good work and just like having impact. And, when you're a person who has great results and people want to work with you. I just found it was very natural and I got a lot of opportunities that came my way. And then, over these last few years as a CEO at Flatiron, I think that theme of change came up so much. And it was one of the hardest things that we had to overcome because, on the one hand, the world has been so chaotic in the last few years that, people's personal lives and just with all of the economic and geopolitical turmoil, like, you know, change is ever present in all of our lives. And then at the same time, within my company, we were on this massive change journey and transforming how we worked and what we worked on. And so there was a subset of team members who just really, really struggled with that and felt like, well, we got feedback in our engagement surveys many times on when's the change going to stop? When are we going to just, stop making changes, whether it's to the org or the strategy or what we do? And it was kind of like, we're not. Any company that's successful over the long run is a living, growing, breathing entity that is constantly changing. And so I really have thought about that a lot recently. It's one of which is why I come back to is such an important piece of advice to think about reframing how you view that in order to make it a win, not a detriment.
And I mean, getting your sort of employees, your people to embrace change. I mean, I've come to the conclusion over the years that nobody loves change until they experience change. So, whenever we're doing a transformation project and we're going to change things, everybody says, don't want to do it. And then you do it and everybody says, this is fantastic. And I don't know why that is and why human beings resist change. And then when you give them change and you make it better, and it has to be better, I guess. But when you give them change, they embrace it and go, this is fantastic. They just can't see it. They can't visualize what the change is going to be like until they're in it. And that may be not true, but I've seen that so many times over the years where people have resisted change. And then do you have any sort of thoughts as to how you take people into that positive zone where they can see change? And sometimes I've talked about taking the terrorists and putting them into, if you can convert a terrorist into an advocate, then they sometimes become your greatest allies. Any sort of techniques you've learned for getting change through and getting people to embrace it?
I think communication is really key. I mean, it all starts with how, can we make it really clear what's changing, why, and what people can expect, to your point. I think it's really hard to see when you're not involved in crafting the change and crafting the strategy, and you're just on the receiving end of like, now we're doing this new thing, or now we're doing this new thing. I think contextualizing, how did we get here? Why are we doing this? What is the intended benefit? What do we need from you? What's your role in the change? Like if you can, really help people see the bigger picture and see the context. We had a value at Flatiron, start with why. Really helping describe why we're doing this, I think matters a lot. And then, constantly kind of collecting feedback and reporting out on how are we progressing against this thing that we said we needed to do. And then the other thing I had found that was really helpful to us is identifying those champions who just naturally are excited about the thing.
Yeah.
Whatever the change is, the people who want to show up as evangelists, and they can come at all levels of an organization. Some of it is leaders certainly role modeling the right behaviors and the change, and it has to start from the top. But I often found the culture makers were hidden at every level of the organization. And if you could identify those folks and spend extra time getting them excited, they would bring along their peers more than anything we could do as senior leaders, telling people what to do. It was kind of getting evangelists excited. And so finding those people and really figuring out how to harness their passion and energy. And then the last thing, I just learned we couldn't underestimate incentives. And what you reward is what people ultimately earn to do. So the questions we ask, the people who get promoted, the, ways in which we recognize people, like they had to be really, really consistent with the changes we were trying to drive, what we said mattered. And we tried to get really, really thoughtful about making sure that all of those decisions were supportive of the culture change and the strategic change that we were working towards.
Mm. And I mean, I think you're the first CEO that I've talked to on Pivot Points that's actually being involved in succession and succession planning. How's that felt? Moving on, and we'll finish with sort of asking you what's next for Carolyn. But I'd love to understand, sort of, given it's so fresh, the whole succession process and how important that is for continuity and building on what you've built.
Yeah, one of the things that I find most motivating and about working in organizations is the opportunity to be a part of a team and to kind of help coach and grow members of that team to step into more responsibility, to elevate how they show up, to step into greater and greater leadership roles. And so I just kind of, as I built our executive team, when I was moving into the CEO role, I was very intentional on thinking about how do I bring together a team who, are smarter than I am, all of whom I think could easily play the role that I'm playing. How do I make sure we have a really deep bench of leaders who can step in? Not because I knew at the time I was going to go at any given point in time, but because I thought, that would help us maximize our performance and the results that we could achieve. It wasn't clear, from the beginning which direction we would go and who would be the single successor. But I always kind of had my eye out of, do we have a handful of people who could play this role? And I thought of that as it's one of the most important things a CEO can do is bring together, team members to take the work forward. And so as I was stepping back, as I mentioned, I had 2 kids over the last few years. I knew that long term, I wanted to raise them on the West Coast. It didn't make sense to lead my company from the West Coast when we were based in New York and had operations in Europe and Japan. And so I knew at some point it would be the right time to make that move. And so for us, it was a process of, a conversation with our board and with the corporate owners on, I think I'd like to start planning for a transition in the next year. And then once it became clear that we were aligned around the right succession plan within Flatiron, it actually went much quicker than I expected, because at that point, it actually is an opportunity I moved into a senior advisor role, and it's an opportunity to let the new team kind of really land and get their runway and step into the role and take the ball forward.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really, one of the things I'm most proud of is that we were able to, build a team internally that's going to carry forward the work that we're doing. Most of the current executive team at Flatiron has been a part of the company for 5, 6, 10 years at this point. And I think that's increasingly rare and a really special thing that I'm enormously proud of.
Fantastic. And that's probably a good point to sort of start drawing to a close. And we always end with a little conversation around a sort of fun fact. And I'm intrigued to know that you climbed Kilimanjaro, and what made you do that? My wife was trying to get me to go up Kilimanjaro, and I just basically say no.
So this was the summer after I got my MBA. I had an opportunity to go do a project across Eastern Africa, actually doing research for HIV testing and diagnostics. And I've always loved the outdoors. And Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain on the continent of Africa, but it's one of the 7 kind of tallest peaks that you can climb without much experience.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing because I went in with like a backpack and really poor supplies and very underprepared. But ultimately, it was just such a cool experience to get to. You do it over 5 days, and you go kind of slowly and you take your time. But to get to the summit and like look at the world from that vantage point was super cool.
Maybe you're persuading me, but hopefully she won't listen to this podcast.
It's been 20 years now, so I don't know what climate change has done to the
because there's snow up there, isn't there?
The peaks around it. Yeah, I mean it was all glaciers and snow at the top, but hopefully it's still holding up.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you very much for coming on Pivot Points. And I wish you well in your next ventures on the West Coast. I'm sure your young boys are going to have a great time growing up in California.
Thank you. I so appreciate you having me, and we're we're really looking forward to it. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.